180 is only up till September. So the new typhoons after September will not be
Yun yung malalakas eh.
correct, Mr. President. So the challenge there is how will NEA tap into the quick response funds? But of course, all of the departments are tapping into that funds already, the SWD, the PWH, and all that. So, but there's a mechanism, Mr. President, assuming that NEA would want to tap into the quick response fund. Mr. President.
Thank you very much. I've taken up your dinner time, and I think I have to turn over to the Minority Leader. Of course, I have questions remaining regarding the ERC, the backlog of decisions that became very controversial, the NPC, and the update on the SPUGs, which are very, very familiar with our good sponsor, but I will leave that for the other interpellators. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you, Mr. President. And if the good, Her Honor wishes, ERC can submit updates on the backlog of the number of cases, as well as NPC can submit information about the SPUG areas, Mr. President.
Thank you.
Maraming salamat, Mr. President and Majority Leader. That will be all for the DOE today.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Senator
thank
Amy.
you.
Majority Leader.
Yes, Mr. President, next to interpret is our Minority Leader, Senator Aquilino Cocomitel. I move that he be recognized.
The hardworking Senate Minority Leader, Senator Coco Pimentel, is recognized to interpellate the sponsor of the measure, Senator Sherwin Gatchalian. You may proceed, sir.
Thank you, Mr. President. With the permission of our sponsor, our chairman, if we can commence with our interpellation. Can we fix our figures? Medyo iba-iba po yung figures ko sa binanggit po ng ating sponsor. What is our, what did we report amounts ba on the new programmed appropriations for the DOE? May we know the amount again?
Ito yung binasa ko.
2.4? Yung ano,
2.4 billion.
2.4, sige po. Kahit yung rounded off na lang po na, 2.4 billion. So that's correct. Same with my figure. But for the budgetary support to government corporations like the NEA, how much is it, Mr. President? 2.6?
2.6, Mr. President.
Okay. And how about for the NAPOCOR?
1.1, Mr. President.
1.1 billion. And then when we since by law, the corporate operating budgets of the NEA is also required to be approved by Congress. May we know the total COB of NEA?
The total COB is 5.2 billion pesos, Mr. President.
How about for NAPOCOR?
It's 39.5 billion pesos.
39.5 billion. And then for PNOC?
It's 1.2 billion pesos, Mr. President.
Okay, so doon po tayo nagka-discrepancy sa figures ko sa ano.
Ano ba dito?
I have for the COB of NAPOCOR 17 billion. Did something change in the COB, or I started with the wrong figure?
No, Mr. President, there's no amendment for NAPOCOR.
Okay, so I may have been mistaken,
Yeah,
Mr.
baka
President.
it's,
So ano yan? While in the PNOC, my figure is 3.2 billion, while the COB to be presented is 1.2 billion only, Mr. President.
Yes, Mr. President.
So okay, so there was no change. Saan nakuha yung ating figure?
From 3.2 to 1.2 billion pesos, Mr. President.
So may change po.
Yes,
So,
Mr. President.
oh, can we explain? Can we explain first the discrepancy in?
Yes, Mr. President,
in our
I'll just
figures?
get the details, Mr. President.
Pero sa po wala. 70, sa man ako yung 17 billion. Layo eh. 22 billion yung difference. Mali tayo from the start. Pero sa 3.2, tama tayo. Para na maintindihan natin.
Yes, Mr. President, we during the hearing, just to give a background, we told the PNOC to report projects they are looking at for 2025. And after looking at the projects, the committee analyzed the projects and looked at the projects that are going to generate new directions for PNOC. And we also looked at projects that are directly competing with the private sector. And my personal take on this, Mr. President, that if the private sector is ready in place in that particular industry or particular technology, government should not compete with the private sector. So we removed some projects that we analyzed that it's competing directly with the private sector. And those projects, for example, the retail energy supplier, the rest, we call it, is a private sector-led industry. And the PNOC was thinking of going into that sector, but the private sector is already there. They were also thinking of building EV charging stations. But as we all know, the private sector is already building EV charging stations, Mr. President. So we looked at the projects that are already occupied by the private sector, and we removed it. And those projects amounted to 2.1 billion pesos, Mr. President.
Thank you. So thank you for the vigilance, Mr. President. So yung concern natin kanina dun sa DOT, yung mga overlap, so ginagawa natin dito to. So sa PNOC, yung PNOC's original proposed corporate operating budget, nakita nyo na ginagawa na ng private sector, diniscourage na po natin sila from undertaking it. So, ano ba sana yung, kunyari, kung na-retain yung 3.2 billion pesos COB ng PNOC, how much doon ang utangin?
Wala, none,
Wala.
Mr. President. None,
Wala.
Mr.
So
President.
the PNOC generates its own funds and they can afford the 3.2 billion.
Correct, Mr. President.
So in effect, by cutting the programs of PNOC, they will be saving for 2025 because they were ready to spend 3.2 billion. Ganun po ba?
Correct, Mr. President. And thank you, Mr. President, for asking that question because we view that PNOC should be a catalyst for technologies that are not present in the private sector, Mr. President. Because if the private sector is already there, then allow the private sector to flourish because they do it better, and we all know that the private sector has the capital to do it, Mr. President. So we analyzed carefully the proposals, Mr. President, and we saw that some of the proposals will be directly competing with the private sector, and it's inefficient for government. So we decided to cut the budget to a tune of 2.1 billion pesos, Mr. President. But thank you for...
So thank you for that. So, so ito bang PNOC, so in effect, may excess funds?
Right now, Mr. President, because of this, they will have excess funds, Mr. President, because
only
they're
because-
generating that amount of revenue.
So ang style nila sa COB nila, unbalanced ano sila, in whatever is their cash inflow, they plan to spend. Never sila nag-accumulate ng earnings or...
Mr. President, the simple computation is they have revenues and they will have amounts for specific projects, and the leftovers will be remitted as dividends, Mr. President.
So
So it's
that,
not a...
the 2 billion that your honor cut can potentially be remitted to the national government as dividends from PNOC.
In theory, yes, Mr. President, it can be remitted as dividends if they will not use it anymore, Mr. President, because that's leftover.
Yeah, pero sabi niyo po, by law, kailangan i-approve natin yung COB nila. So, they should not be able to use that. Tama ba ako sa pagkaintindi ko? 3.2 billion ang naisip nila, 1.2 in-approve po natin na Kongreso. Under the law, we must approve. Therefore, if it's not approved,
Yes,
They have the collection, but they cannot use it. Hence, to be remitted to the national government at the end of the year, siguro. End of the year 2025.
You're right, Mr. President. I was just sharpening my answers. You're right, Mr. President, that the Senate or Congress approves the maximum amount that they can spend. And since we only approve 1 billion plus, they can only spend to that maximum amount. So, and the 2.1 billion, and in theory can become savings, and they can remit that as dividends, Mr. President. But if they want to spend that again, they have to come back to Congress to seek for approval.
Yes, okay. Sige, thank you po. Same, that's the same rule for NEA and for NEA and for NPC. Is that the same rule? Theoretically ba? Theoretically speaking, ganun. Yung COB nila, ano rin, ina-approve din eh. So they cannot spend beyond the level approved by Congress. Tama po yun.
Yeah. Mr. President, in the case of NEA, Mr. President, the entire amount should be approved by Congress, Mr. President, including the subsidies coming from national government.
Yeah, so let's talk about NEA. Ang NEA corporate operating budget 5.2 billion. Ang ating subsidy 2.6 billion. So yung 2.6 billion ng kalahati is revenue of NEA itself. Tama po? Income or revenue of NEA itself. Tama?
Correct, Mr. President. Correct.
Sige. So meaning to say that the income of NEA is not actually sufficient for its plans. That's why we need to infuse 50% halos ng plano niya.
Correct,
2.6
Mr.
billion.
President.
Sige.
That's right.
With NAPOCOR, we are subsidizing 1.1 billion of its expenses, but it plans to spend 39.5 billion pesos. So meaning to say, NAPOCOR can afford the 38.4 billion thereabouts. Tama po sa kanyang
Yes,
corporate
Mr. President.
inutang.
Yes, meron yan.
Uutangin ba ng NAPOCOR yun? Or magkano ba yung kanyang self-generated income?
Yes, Mr. President. It comes from different forms, Mr. President. Like, for example, Senator Aimee mentioned about the universal charge for missionary electrification. So a part of that will come from that. Some of the amounts will come from loans as well,
Loans,
Mr. President. Yeah.
So, kunyari
And
nga lang,
advances
for 2025 lang, how much of the corporate operating budget of NAPOCOR, 39.5 billion, magkano po utangin? Ano ba ito? Revenue to revenue? Revenues ba ito? Ano ba tawag dito? Revenue? May gastos yan. Bakit sale na nga ito? Gastos pa ba yan?
Budget yan for operations. Mga particulars for the operations.
Yeah, we have it here. Mr. President, for NPC's corporate funds amounting to 37 billion, 32 billion will come from universal charge for missionary electrification. And then 2 billion will come from operation and maintenance agreement. And then 1.7 billion will come from the PSAM Corporation. And then 200 million will come from universal charge for environmental charge, UC environmental charge. So those are the breakdowns, Mr. President.
So just looking at the 2025 COB of Napoco, magkano po yung shortfall niya? Uutangin niya? Or tabla na yon with the government subsidy?
Tabla na, Mr. President. Correct, tabla na.
So the national
Kasi-
government makes up for the shortfall.
Correct, Mr. President.
Okay,
Because
sige
for
po.
the UCME, the missionary electrification, is already 32 billion, Mr. President.
Correct, yes. Malaki na po yun.
But there's a caveat to that, Mr. President.
sige, ano po?
The ERC chairperson mentioned to me. The 32 billion is hinged on the approval of ERC because they also have applications to the ERC to increase the UCME, Mr. President. But that's already, for budgetary purposes, that's already the budget, the assumption.
So they assume nga, tama, they anticipate.
Correct,
parang ganun.
Mr.
But I think the ERC is not bound. Huh?
No,
Oo,
no,
hindi
Mr.
bound.
President.
Talagang,
In fact,
nandito pinapakita ng independence po ng ERC.
correct.
Okay. So in case, let us say, the rate increase po ba tawag doon? RDI, the rate increase is not approved. So what happens?
Like for example, Mr. President, during when the prices of the Ukraine invasion, when the prices of diesels shot up 3 to 4 times, they cannot just go to the ERC and request to increase the UCME because that will increase our electricity rates.
Correct.
So
Of
they went to
everybody,
the bank.
di ba? Of everybody yan.
Of
eh.
everybody, Mr. President. Everybody on grid.
Right.
So the NPC went to Land Bank to borrow, Mr. President, just to cover that shortfall, Mr. President.
May we know the status or the current balance of NPC's debts, Mr. President?
President, currently it's at 10 billion, Mr. President.
So, 10 billion yan. 10 billion since the time that it was allowed to unload its debts. Di ba? Tama ba yun? We're talking about the same entity na allowed to unload its debts or liabilities to PISAM? Tama ba ito? We're talking about the same entity, right?
Yes, Mr. President, you're correct that this is the first time that NPC borrowed to subsidize its operation in the middle of the year, Mr. President. Actually, I was privy to that, and I was talking to the good secretary about that. That because of the mid-year increase in diesel, they couldn't come to Congress to ask for an increase in their subsidy. So what they did is to cover their operations they went to the bank, to Land Bank in particular, to borrow for the shortfall. Or else, Mr. President, they cannot buy diesel and some of our areas will have brownouts.
So, itong debt ng NPC na 10 billion has been incurred over how many years? 1 year lang
Just
ito?
1 year, Mr.
1 year
President.
lang
That's
ito?
very recent. During the
Okay.
time of the Ukrainian invasion,
Okay,
Mr.
okay. So,
President.
Okay, kasi di ba parang na-zero ang debts niya, sinalo nung isang
Yes.
corporate entity, which
PISAM.
is PISAM, yes. Okay, so malaki-laki po ito. 10 billion in 1 year, Mr. Chairman. I mean, can you take a look at the details? Kasi kayo po yung recognized expert natin dito, Mr. President.
Well, Mr. President, it's a very difficult position for NPC at that time because they have an application with the ERC to increase their UCME collection. But ERC, of course, is balancing also the situation. So in the meantime, they borrowed amounts to fund the shortfall in terms of purchase of diesel. But hopefully, when ERC approves their application, then that they can eventually pay off the loan and use the collection from the UCME to fund their operation, Mr. President.
Di ba Napocor has, we have tremendously reduced the responsibilities of Napocor, di ba? Ngayon, parang na siya sa
Off-grid areas, Mr.
off-grid
President.
areas or
Yes.
sa mga
SPAG areas.
SPAG, no?
SPAG areas, Mr. President. That's their only responsibility now to power the off-grid
So,
areas.
is it to perform the missionary electrification through the small power utilities group? Ito po ang kanyang to provide the power generation for this? Apa.
Yes, Mr.
So,
President.
if you look at the COB of Napocor, then that's what is costing us.
Yes, correct, Mr.
Yan yun.
President.
To the tune of around 39 billion pesos.
Yes. A lot of it, Mr. President, is really majority will go to payment of fuel,
Kaya nga,
buying of spare parts, upgrading of generators. But they're also embarking, Mr. President, on what we call the hybrid system so that they can reduce the purchase of diesel. They've already started putting up hybrid system, meaning solar and diesel. So you only use the diesel at night, but during the day you use the solar.
Which you mentioned earlier.
Yes,
So-
but this is for NPC. This is for
Why?
NPC.
What was that earlier when you mentioned that?
The other one is-
mentioned you solar, diesel, and battery. And in what
Yeah.
context?
Well,
yun?
the microgrid, Mr. President.
Microgrid.
Yes.
But
yes.
microgrids are used by Napocor.
Actually, they can use it, Mr. President. In fact, in the law, they are the proponent of microgrids as well, Mr. President. So, in other-
When there's a microgrid, most likely that's a Napocor area.
yes, Mr. President.
Okay.
Yes, Mr. President.
So yan po pala ang cost sa atin. Iba pa yan, Iba yan sa mga, iba yung kanina na yung sabi nyo 7%, wala pa ngang electrification dun eh. So ito yung mga off-grid, microgrid, small power utilities group, island group. So how many households po ito? Electrified households, di ba? These are how many electrified households are being now served by this by Napocor to the tune of 39 billion pesos.
Mr. President, they're serving 479,000 households, Mr. President. Nandito yan.
And may we know the reason why they are not connected to the main grid? I'm sure we want them connected, di ba? But there must be some physical reason they cannot be connected or another reason. We just want to make it off record, Mr. President.
Sorry, Mr. President, the served areas is 1.2. Tama? 1.2. What's in my data? Yeah, Mr. President, the served areas is 1.2 million households. The unserved areas is 479,000 households, Mr. President.
Okay.
Sorry, Mr. President, for that confusion.
The served areas na 1.2 million households under the
Missionary areas.
missionary areas.
Yes, missionary areas lang to, Mr. President.
Okay, and then the
Mga islands. Yeah,
okay, and then the 479,000 households would be the 7% not yet electrified.
Part of, Mr. President, because
Yes.
kasi meron ka pang on-grid.
Yes,
Yung mga
yes.
nasa bundok
Okay,
naman,
I get
Mr.
it.
President.
Thank you.
So this is only in the missionary,
Yeah,
which
missionary.
is islands, Mr. President.
Sige, can we have the reason why they cannot be? Of course, the desire nga, ulitin ko, the desire is to connect them to the main grid. Actually, yung three main grids nga natin, kino-connect nga natin, di ba, to each other. So sila, we want them to be, why? What are the reason why they could not be or could never be connected to the
Like,
main
Mr.
grid?
Mr. President, it's a question of economics, Mr. President. Like, for example, Pag-asa Island. It's virtually impossible to connect it via grid extension. So we will use microgrid systems there. No? But Pagasa actually is a big island. But we have islands that have only 20 households or 30 households, and they're really in a very far island, Mr. President. So it's not practical and economical to connect them through grid extension. So we use microgrids, or sometimes we just put generators because the houses are located near the generating facility, Mr.
So
President.
nakalista na yan sila? All
Yes,
of this.
Mr. President.
So
Meron na
kunyari,
sila.
example natin, Camiguin Island, it's an island. What is it? Is it connected or not connected to the main grid?
It's connected, Mr.
Connected.
President, via submarine cable.
To sa Northern Mindanao. What if Siquijor Island, is it connected? Yung pala. Iba-iba. Iba-ibang city.
It's not connected, Mr. President. No. It's not connected.
Okay.
But you're right, Mr. President. The goal is to connect all of these islands. No? Like Mindoro, Mr. President, there's a plan to connect Mindoro to Batangas, Mr. President, and make it part of the Luzon grid, Mr. President.
So some of the reasons they are not yet connected can be overcome.
Yes, Mr. President, it's a matter of demand. No, like for example, Mindoro has Calapan City, I was explaining earlier, which is a highly urbanized area. And it makes it economical to expand the grid from the onshore to Mindoro, Mr. President. But some areas are really far and they have very few houses. So it doesn't make sense to connect them to the grid because the grid lines, the transmission lines itself is very costly.
So, possibly pa lang, you are not on the grid, but you are on the same island as a certain populated area on the grid.
Yes, Mr.
You're
President.
just physically too far away. But
Yes.
it's overland. Hindi natin So, hindi natin
Yes.
siya kinoconnect, although it's overland.
Yes, Mr. President.
Okay. So,
Correct.
yes,
Mr. President.
we understand. Kasi at least, kaya kinumpare ko si Camiguin versus Siquijor, iba pala situation ng dalawa. Oh. So at least we understand, Mr.
Iba,
President.
Mr. President.
So yun ang Okay, so for this, I think you have 278 power plants under SPAG. Tama po ba yan? Napocor.
Yes.
Napocor power plants yun. Tama?
Yes,
Okay.
Mr. President.
So what is the technology used?
Diesel.
All of them.
All of them, Mr. President. Except for the hybrid that I mentioned earlier.
How many are the hybrid na po?
4 areas, Mr. President. But that's the goal because the goal is to reduce the consumption of diesel. And that's also one reason why the UCME is increasing because it pays for the diesel and the operating cost of diesel power plant. So the goal is to reduce the consumption of diesel, Mr. President, eventually.
So makikita natin yung sa COB ng Napocor. Yun siya. The COB of Napocor, it's Napocor's decision, di ba? Tama? It's Napocor which will decide what technology to adopt in their SPAG generating plants.
Correct, Mr. President.
Do we see it? Kasi kayo pong nag-examine yan in detail.
Yes.
Do we see it in the COB na palayo? So there is really that effort to use an alternative source of energy other than diesel? Ito ba yung budget? Ito na yung 39 billion. Ito na ito, 39 billion. Nasagot na to. Yan yung 39 billion, di ba? Dominant technology, diesel. Power. Percentage power.
Mr. President, aside from the 14, Napocor has 16 other areas to install hybrid power plants, Mr. President. I have the list here. So it's only recently that under the leadership of Secretary Lutilla that they took this track of installing hybrid power plants instead of purely diesel power plants, Mr. President.
So ganito na lang po, yung total power generated by Napocor through their SPAG plants equals X, and diesel, ilan dun yung renewable energy. So yun, so makikita natin yung percentage. All the rest, diesel. Ganun na yan. Okay, so Are we ready to give the figures or pwede naman in writing na lang po kung di pa tayo ready?
We'll submit it, Mr. President. I only have here but we need to compare it. Like, for example, in their planned rollout of that 16 hybrid power plants, the solar component is about 2,700 kilowatt peak, Mr. President. So, but we'll make sense of it by comparing it with the total, Mr. President. We will compare it with the
Yes,
total.
yes.
I know what you're getting. Is how much of this hybrid is compared to the total, Mr. President. We'll give you that number.
Actually, yes, but the hybrid is also part diesel. Eh.
Yes,
So,
Mr. President.
Actually, the fund in question is how much is renewable. Of the SPAG generation of Napocor, how much percentage is renewable, which is solar. Tama? Solar na lang yun.
Yeah.
So-
To date, Mr. President, only 4 of the total
No,
area.
percentage sa power
percentage.
sa capacity ba. So anyway, if the sponsor is not ready with the figure, pwede na lang po in writing na lang po, Mr. President.
Mr. President, for solar, it's about 2% of the total generation, and hydro is renewable energy is about 8%, Mr. President, because in some areas they also use run-of-river hydro, yung maliliit na hydro. So they have hydro, they have wind, they have solar, a total of 8% of the total generation, Mr. President. So
Pwede na,
it's
Mr. President.
still
Oh,
small, Mr. President.
But at least, pwede na. I mean, close to 10%, dandahan, pinapa-increase natin. Okay.
The goal really, Mr. President, is to reduce the consumption of diesel so that we don't pay for diesel. And Napocor has already started converting some of its plants to a hybrid system.
Siguro meron naman siguro timeline na yan na meron na silang plans, no? We just ask for just to test Napocor if they really have a plan. Can the plan be submitted?
Yes, Mr. President. We'll request Napocor to submit the timeline on using hybrid systems, Mr. President. But just to share, Mr. President, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, there's no hybrid system. But after that time frame, there's now 4 units and 4 hybrid system and 16 in the pipeline, Mr. President.
Kaya, so pag sinabi mo ba walang hybrid system 2 years ago, 2 years ago, renewable energy was 0%? Or andun na si hydro?
Only solar, Mr. President. The hydro is already existing because it's run off river.
So ilan,
Yeah.
ilan, so 6%. So 6% ay hydro eh. 2% kasi si solar.
Solar, Mr.
So
President.
only 2% pala.
Yeah, maliit lang yung solar.
Aba. Sige po. But maybe in due time. So what is NEA is here, no? What is the participation of NEA in the electrification program of the government?
Well, Mr. President, it's the lead agency that is tasked to electrify household in the electric co-op franchise areas, Mr. President. So that's their task, Mr. President. So they provide subsidies to electric co-ops to electrify the last mile, so to speak.
Okay, if we now look at the total area electrified, how much of that is under electric co-op responsibility? Kasi yun yung bali NEA jurisdiction eh. Di ba sagot dito, how much does NEA allocate? Hindi ba yan yung 5.2 billion?
Baka gusto niyo matanong sir yung sa intensifying household electric.
Ko nang naintindihan yung intensify.
Ayan sir, kasi meron siyang program na national intensifying.
Andiyan yan, ito na ito yung 5.2. Sige, directly na lang sasabihin ko, is directly for that last mile.
Miss-
section.
Mr. President, under NEA is about 1.9 million household, Mr. President, of which, sorry, what is 60%? Yeah, what is 60% of 1.9? 1.6? 1.15. Mr. President, under NEA is about 1.15 million households that are not yet electrified, Mr. President. Under NEA, under the electric co-ops.
Yeah, but ang claim kasi natin, 93% of the Philippines is electrified. Of that 93, ilan ang under the jurisdiction of the NEA? Laki siguro. Kasi
About 90%, Mr. President, because that...
ito lang Metro Manila is an example na hindi NEA.
Correct.
Right,
Metro
right.
Manila, Cebu, Davao, Iloilo City. So most of the highly urbanized cities.
That's a
will-
big role, Bali. Big role.
Big role, Mr.
Yes.
President.
Then last mile means to say that what
Well, those
what
are
the
areas
sponsor
that
means
are, for example, in the far-flung areas. For example, there's a-
papautangin ni NEA sa electric co-op so that
so they
magkaroon ng
yes, so they can build the lines going to those far-flung areas, Mr. President. They give they give subsidies.
Yes. Ano, is this utang, grant, or ano?
Subsidy. Government subsidy. Yeah, government subsidy, Mr. President.
So NEA gives subsidies to electric co-ops. Okay na yun. Out na yun, out. Walang,
Yes.
with no expectation of payment or return.
Yes, Mr. President. And then the goal there is to electrify those households in your franchise area that are unreachable or very difficult to reach, Mr. President. Because
Yes,
sometimes, most of the time, Mr. President, those areas are uneconomical when you put
Correct.
electricity lines. And for a private DU, it doesn't make sense for the private DU to put those lines. So government, exercising its social mandate, gives out the subsidies so they can build the lines to electrify those areas that are in unviable areas.
So using NEA's 2025 COB na of 5.2 billion, how much would be grants? Or subsidy pala, subsidies, ang tawag nila, subsidies to electric co-ops. Yan ang sagot mo doon. Check nyo, sulat.
About 1.86 billion, Mr. President.
So that subsidy, is that more or less the level as a recurring expense in the COB of NEA? Is that a recurring expense or amount in the COB of NEA? Is it in that vicinity, 1.8 billion?
More or less, Mr. President. More or less. It's an amount that it's a constant amount, more or less, Mr.
Are the
President.
recipients more or less the same also, year in, year out?
No, Mr. President, they have a criteria that they exercise in order to select which electric co-ops can avail of the subsidy, Mr. President.
Kayo na yun, self-limitation na yun, nilalagay nyo sa 1.8 billion.
Correct, Mr.
Kasi
President.
okay, what is the universe of the electric co-ops entitled to avail of the subsidy from NEA? How many?
121, Mr. President, electric co-ops.
Pero yung electric co-ops, sir, may utang pa rin sila, di ba? So they are receiving subsidy, no obligation to repay, and yet they still have debts. So,
Mr. President, the loans are geared towards their operations and working capital. So the way, in simple terms, if you have problems with your operations, NEA can loan you, but you have to pay interest. If
Ibang
you want-
program ng NEA
Ibang
yun.
program yun.
Ah,
If you want to expand your lines and electrify all of your areas, government gives you subsidies, Mr.
very
President.
strict tayo ron sa subsidy. Talagang we audit them na para dun lang.
Correct, Mr.
para
President.
dun lang.
In fact, we have special provisions that if they cannot liquidate, if the ECs do not liquidate, they cannot get subsidies anymore because you have to also liquidate and show government where the subsidies went.
So ano kaya resulta, sir?
Actually,
maganda ang liquidation rate. This is not prepayment rate or payment rate or liquidation rate. So What is it? What's the level? Marami ka bang dala? Hindi na naman tayo abot sa 11 o'clock. Ano ba ito? Hindi ko ito naintindihan. Ano ito? Ano ba ito? Ano na ito interest na ito? Operations. May sale? What is it? In order to sell? In order to sell?
Yes, sir. Kailangan nilang gumastos ng 6
Then how much ang return? Wala ka alam.
Wala, sir.
Sige.
Mr. President, the liquidation rate is about 92%.
92.
92%. So in other words, those ECs that are given
Yes.
subsidies, 92% of them liquidate, Mr. President.
So congratulations to NEA as well as to the EC. So kung nangyayari yun, subsidized, liquidated, na-connect, ibig sabihin mo, yun na yung reason bumababa na yun unelectrified percentage.
Correct, Mr. President.
Ganun dapat po yun, tama?
Tama, Mr. President.
Okay.
But, Mr. President, our population is also growing. So you have new households coming to life in different areas. So it's a moving target, so to speak, Mr. President. But that's the objective, is the subsidies to accommodate the growth in terms of number of households, Mr. President.
Okay. We have heard the explanation, but we need to double check that, Mr. President. Let's now go to the budget of the DOE OSEC. Special account in the general fund. We have Comprehensive Regional Energy Study in the Philippines, or CRESP. Is this sponsor familiar with that? We just noticed na from 54.9 million for this year, for next year, ginawa lang natin 4.7 million. So why are we now, what is this? Is this study done? Are we winding up the study? CRESP, C-R-E-S-P. Ano ba to? Ano ba to? Balance o budget? Binibigay? Binibigyan.
Mr. President, I was made to understand that this is a study, a household level study. It's a household level study, Mr. President, that surveys the consumption, the demographics of the household in terms of energy consumption and energy use, Mr.
Right.
President. And the number of households that will be surveyed is now reduced because they have done the surveys in the past already. So max konti na lang po yung masa-survey this coming 2025.
Okay.
That's why the budget
50
was
million
reduced.
po yung binawas natin, if I'm not mistaken. So,
Yes, tama.
so hindi pa matatapos yung study. Dapat siguro ang mga studies natatapos para magamit natin yung conclusion natin sa
Yeah,
studies.
2025, Mr. President, will be the study will be completed. The survey started this year, Mr. President, and they target to finish it next year. And the next year also will include the analysis and recommendations, Mr. President.
Okay, so I hope that will be shared with Congress para
Yes, Mr.
ano
President,
natin.
the department will send a copy and their analysis to Congress.
Can I ask the PNOC about its COB? Meron siya rito entry na 6.7 million sale and monetization of the banked gas. What is this, PNOC? Is this an expense that you need to incur 6.7 million pesos to sell and monetize the bank gas ito, malampaya siguro to related concept. Tama ba? Naging 1.2 na lang ito kasi, hindi na to 2.6 eh. Naging 1.2 na to. Yan. Binawasan nga ni Sherwin. Pero tinanggal ba yan? But Mr. Chairman, isa ba to sa tinanggal mo? Kasi
No, Mr. President, no, hindi
Na-retain
kasama
ba?
siya, Mr. President.
is this an expense?
This is an expense. This is
So,
to
yes.
sell and monetize the bank
Kaya
gas.
nga, in order to sell and
In
monetize
order
the
to
bank
sell.
gas, sige, when PNOC incurs 6.7 million, what is now the expected return of the sale and monetization of the bank gas?
It's about $9 million per month expected income, Mr. President.
So, $9 million, kung i-times 650 natin ito, around half a billion, 500 million pesos, and we spend 6.7 million to do that.
This is only for admin costs, Mr. President.
Yes, nga.
So,
In order to sell, monetize. Kaya nga, so that's the bank gas which we talked about around 2 to 3 years ago. So ano ba status no na that's an asset of the Philippine government? How much is our estimated asset in the form of bank gas?
estimate but
Volume. Wag po price, but volume. Sa Malampaya ito.
So the government owns about 70 petajoules, Mr. President, of bank gas left, Mr. President.
That's in the existing Malampaya, di ba Malampaya, what do you call that, sir? Reserve. Reserve.
Yes, Mr.
Gas
President,
reserve.
you're correct.
Okay.
Yes. The Malampaya natural gas, Mr. President.
70 petajoules of bank gas.
Correct.
Okay. That's who confirms such a figure? Who tells us na ganyan pa yung laman sa baba?
It's PNOC mother company who determines that, Mr. President. Yeah,
Sige. PNOC is here, di ba?
correct, Mr. President.
Did they do the study themselves? Or they're relying on a third party, quoting a third party? Ganun ba?
But Mr. President, the consortium, the original consortium, it's a commitment that the original consortium made to the Philippine government to deliver 100 petajoules, Mr. President. And we have sold some of it in the past. I remember San Miguel was one of the buyers. Oh, sorry, Mr. President. I'll correct myself. It's First Gen who bought the bank gas in the past. San Miguel was not the buyer, and there's 70 petajoules left over, Mr. President. And I understand that the new consortium validated and committed to deliver 70 petajoules remaining, Mr. President.
So it is confirmed that we have sold 30 petajoules.
Yes, Mr. President.
At
Over time, Mr.
Yes,
President.
over time. And How much ang generated natin dyan? Billions.
Oh, meron.
Billions siguro.
It's about $9 million per month, Mr. President. That's the
Since when? Since when? When do we start counting? For PNOC. 3 B. So half billion per month. So 12 months. So 6 billion.
2017, Mr. President. Starting 2017.
Around 48 to 50 billion, Mr. President, pesos ang kinita na natin over time. $40 to 50 billion pesos, more or less.
Yes, Mr.
In that
President.
vicinity?
Yes, that vicinity, Mr. President.
So thank you. So
And we'll submit
at least-
an accounting of that, Mr. President, to his honor, Mr. President.
pinapakita lang natin sa taong bayan yung kita rin natin dun
Correct,
sa
sa
Malampaya.
Bangkas.
Yes, Apo. Kasi this is pursuant to agreement siguro part
Correct.
part na ito dun sa 40 around 40. Hindi pa ito yon sa 45% sa income.
Wala
yun,
pa, Mr.
Sa
President.
income kukunin yun, sir, no? Kasi tinatanong ko yung professor ko kasi sa College of Law, kaya kaya ang tanong ko, ang pag-address ko kay Secretary Lotilla, sir, may professor in the College of Law.
Well, Mr. President, when was that? Mr. President, in 2008, PNOC bought the bank gas, Mr. President. And they started monetizing it in 2017, Mr. President. And they're still monetizing it. That's why the admin cost is necessary because of the monetizing
So it's a
activity.
separate transaction.
It's a
all-
separate
altogether.
transaction, Mr. President.
So then how much did it cost us when PNOC bought it?
Do you remember?
Yes, can you
Yeah, Mr. President,
can I
we'll
be
submit
given-
a report on that, Mr. President.
I will be greatly disappointed kung masyado pong mahal natin pagbili, Mr. President.
14, Mr. President, the president of PNOC is here. He said we bought it for 14 billion pesos, Mr. President. 14 billion pesos
In 2008.
in 2008.
Okay, so we will just do our own projection, Mr. President. Let's go to COA report, Mr. President, kasi medyo na-alarm lang po ako rito. If it's really still outstanding, DOE was not able to collect training commitment. Iba pa to, and development assistance, dalawang funds po ito. Training commitment, 907 million pesos, failure to collect, and then development assistance, 389 million pesos. Number one, is this accurate? Are the figures accurate? And then why? May we know why?
Actually, I flagged the department about that, Mr. President, during the hearing. But we'll...
And then
I'll
failure
get
to
some
collect
updates.
from who?
I'll get some
Sino
updates, Mr.
yung
President.
hindi natin nakolektahan? May we know for the record? Pangalanan na po natin. Kunin niyo yung mga pangalan ng sino hindi nakolektahan.